please welcome the Honorary Chairman of the Truman Library Institute, Clifton Truman Daniel.
Thank you, thank you. Good evening. I am, as that disembodied voice just said, Clifton Truman Daniel, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to this exceptional gathering celebrating the 75th anniversary of the founding of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the American president who envisioned and championed its creation, my grandfather, Harry S. Truman. On this proud occasion, and on behalf of my family, the Truman Presidential Library, and the Truman Library Institute, I want to thank all of you who are with us both online and here in this beautiful McGowan Theater at the National Archives, and really everybody who's made this evening possible. In particular, I want to recognize our partners at the Center for New American Security, CNAS, led by CEO Richard Fontaine. Many thanks also to Andrea Kendall-Taylor, Kate Johnston, and Leighton Simons for your work on behalf of this event. Together with the CNAS, the Truman Library Institute is proud to serve as one of only a handful of U.S.-based institutional partners for the NATO Public Forum, part of a wider network of organizations tasked with amplifying the messages from this year's summit. Thanks to the National Archives, our host partner, for an unparalleled backdrop for this special event. Our nation's presidential libraries, including the Truman Presidential Library and Museum in Missouri, are operated by the National Archives. And I'd like to give a warm welcome to Cara Blond, Director of Presidential Libraries, and to Truman Library Director Kurt Graham. I'm grateful to our esteemed speakers and panelists who you will meet shortly, and to the Truman Library Institute board and staff, led by Alex Burden. And hats off to Cassie Pekarsky, the Institute's Director of Strategic Initiatives, for peerless skill and execution. I thought that was a little hyperbolic, but no, that's accurate. And if you'll indulge me, I'd like to say a few words about my grandfather. When he was sworn in as president on April 12, 1945, following the death of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, he inherited a worldwide catastrophe. The Second World War would soon be over, but with VE Day came the enormous challenge of rebuilding a war-ravaged world, countering Soviet expansionism, and preventing a third world war. Grandpa said, "I want peace, and I am willing to fight for it." His first major act after winning the 1948 presidential election was to direct the United States State Department, to open negotiations for a transatlantic alliance. Thus was born the most significant result of Grandpa's foreign policy strategy, America's membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In his mind, NATO was the natural extension of the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and the United Nations. Together, pillars supporting a structure for peace that was our surest protection against the cruel cost of war. When 12 countries signed the treaty in Washington, D.C. on April 1st, 1949, my grandfather expressed the prayers of the world. We hope to create a shield against aggression and the fear of aggression. He had created the post-war order. It's worth noting that in 1949, plenty of Americans thought NATO was a bad idea. The rallying cry of those isolationists and non-interventionists, America first, can still be heard today. As NATO turns 75 and politicians and pundits weigh the cost and merits of international leadership and alliances, Grandpa's warning still rings true. We can well afford to pay the price of peace. Our only alternative is to pay the terrible cost of war. Tonight, as the 2024 NATO Summit draws to a close, we find ourselves in a position that my grandfather would recognize. Totalitarianism is on the rise. Democracy and peace are under attack. A mobilized Russia under the dictatorial Vladimir Putin is once again threatening Europe. Over the past few days, one central question has informed every conversation. How do NATO allies protect their citizens, 1 billion people, as the world faces the most dangerous security environment since the Cold War? I can't recall a time when it felt more urgent to understand how nations, and you and I as individuals, can come together despite our differences. How fortunate we are, then, to have a star-studded roster of experts in foreign policy, leadership, and global security to discuss the measures that we must take to safeguard democracy at home and around the world. While we celebrate the legacy of the strongest military alliance in human history, we also will explore our best options to ensure NATO's success for the next 75 years. In short, we have a front row seat on the world stage, so let's get to it. It's my privilege to introduce Admiral Rob Bauer, the 33rd chair of NATO's Military Committee. As the military advisor to the Secretary General and the North Atlantic Council, Admiral Bauer is NATO's most senior military officer. This strategic leadership role follows nearly 4 decades of distinguished service in the Netherlands Royal Navy, and from 2017 to 2021 as Chief of Defense for the Netherlands Armed Forces. Admiral Bauer very graciously accepted our invitation following his recent visit to the Dole Institute of Politics at the University of Kansas, just across the state line from my grandfather's presidential library. As I'm sure you know, his insights on Russia and Ukraine in particular are regularly in the headlines, including his view that the outcome of that conflict will determine the fate of the world. His message is one of preparedness, and we might all do well to adopt his personal mantra and guiding principle, expect the unexpected. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Admiral Rob Bauer.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm deeply honored to have been invited to say a few words at the start of this splendid gathering. To share the stage tonight with someone I hold in the highest possible regard, my friend, General C.Q. Brown. He's an exceptional leader who proves that alliances are not just formed by nations. They are formed by people. And even though this great alliance protects 1 billion people on Earth, a single person can still make a monumental difference. And that was certainly true in 1949 when President Truman signed the treaty. Truman realized that North American and European security are intrinsically linked. He helped erect a shield that has been the foundation for peace, stability, and prosperity on our soil for 75 years. A whole generation was born, grew up, and died under the safety and protection of that shield. NATO is a success that not even its founding fathers could have foreseen. When General Eisenhower was asked to be the first Supreme Allied Commander in Europe in 1950, he had already retired from the military. He had become president of Columbia University, and he had promised his wife that they would move to a farm near Gettysburg. So when President Truman came with the request, Eisenhower asked him to make it a presidential order, probably so that he could defend the decision at home. Now, Eisenhower later said to a friend, "They want me for NATO because nobody else wants it. Nobody believes it's going to work." In explaining NATO to the American people in a March 1949 radio address, Secretary of State Dean Acheson asked, "Will the treaty accomplish its purpose?" No one can say with certainty. We can only act on our convictions. Now, Acheson was convinced that NATO was essential for the restoration of the economic and political health of the world, as was Eisenhower, as was President Truman. They were right. And all of us here, 75 years later, still share those same convictions. This summit here in Washington was historic. NATO did not only physically return to Washington, the place where 12 allies signed a groundbreaking treaty, but also in a wider sense. NATO is going back to its origins. After 3 decades of crisis management elsewhere, we are returning to the collective defense of Allied territory. We are protecting not just the physical safety of 1 billion people on Earth, but also the democratic values and freedom we all hold dear. We live in an era of rising conflict with widespread fears of an ever-widening downward spiral of violence. An era in which autocratic leaders seek to destroy democracy abroad so that they can retain autocracy at home. NATO was created to prevent that from ever happening. When President Truman signed the Washington Treaty, he said that while it was a simple document, just 14 articles, lawyers would love it, had it existed earlier, it would have prevented 2 world wars. And the first Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, Field Marshal Montgomery, said that in strengthening NATO lies the best hope in preventing a third. So how do we do that? How do we strengthen the strongest alliance in the world? What it boils down to is that we need to fight for the we in a world of me. Collective defense is truly a task for the collective. It's a job for all allies and all parts of our societies. NATO allies represent 50% of the world's economic power and 50% of the world's military power. So we have it within ourselves to strengthen our defensive shield and ramp up our deterrence. If we want to maintain peace, we need to start preparing for war. President Putin was genuinely shocked when he saw how united our response was to the war in Ukraine. But he still thinks he can outlast and outsuffer us. And President Xi is watching us equally close, secretly supporting Russia in its war against Ukraine, buying influence in allied nations, monitoring our every move, and becoming ever more aggressive against its neighbors to test their and our reaction. In the end, they expect we will break, and that we will choose the me above the we. Ladies and gentlemen, I am confident that we will remain united as long as we remind ourselves of how far we have come and what we are able to do. NATO allies share so much more than the shores of the Atlantic. We share an unwavering belief that democracy can triumph over tyranny, that freedom can triumph over oppression, and that light can triumph over darkness. In the years that are to come, NATO will continue to do exactly what the NATO flag symbolizes. All allies will follow the same compass. Together, our 3.5 million men and women in uniform send an unmistakable message to any potential aggressor. And together, we embody an important truth that we are much stronger together than we are alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Bauer. Ladies and gentlemen, may we have one more round of applause for Admiral Bauer. I'm honored to represent my grandfather's legacy this evening, but I am also keenly aware that Admiral Bauer and our next guest truly embody that legacy through their daily commitments and sacrifices. My grandfather understood that this would be a long game, and he was right. In 1949, he reminded Americans that, and I quote, "The kind of peace we seek cannot be won at a single stroke or by a single nation. Peace worthy of the name can be assured only by the combined effort of many peoples willing to make sacrifices in the cause of freedom." One of those who have dedicated their life to the cause of freedom is Ambassador Julianne Smith, the United States Permanent Representative to NATO. Ambassador Smith had hoped to join us this evening, but is unable to do so because of her commitments to the summit. When her staff reached out with regrets, we, of course, responded immediately, as one would, that securing world peace comes first. In April, my wife Polly and I had the pleasure of being Ambassador Smith's guests at the U.S. mission to NATO, along with a small Truman delegation that traveled from the U.S. to Belgium. And I was thinking if there was any small positive side to Ambassador Smith's not being able to be with us this evening, is it that she would certainly recognize that I am wearing the same suit, shirt, and tie that I was in Brussels. It was an honor to join her and Secretary Blinken and NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg and representatives from all 32 NATO nations, and to unveil and dedicate a bronze statue of my grandfather, commemorating his role in the founding of NATO. The second casting of the monument that stands in the Capitol Rotunda now is permanently installed in the beautiful gardens surrounding Truman Hall. When we went to view it, the ambassador's dog, Scout, thought that Grandpa was an intruder and barked at him for 2 minutes. But otherwise, it's perfect. And I think Ambassador Smith put it even more perfectly. She said, "It creates a place for us to reflect on the milestone moment, which was the foundation of this great alliance and how far we have come since then." Our keynote address this evening will be delivered by General C.Q. Brown, Jr., the 21st Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As Chairman, General Brown serves as the nation's highest-ranking military officer and the principal military advisor to the President, Secretary of Defense, and National Security Council. General Brown was commissioned in 1984 as a distinguished graduate of the ROTC program at Texas Tech University. He has served in a variety of positions at the squadron and wing levels and is a command pilot with more than 3,000 flying hours, including 130 combat hours. Notably, General Brown has commanded a fighter squadron, the U.S. Air Force Weapons School, 2 fighter wings, U.S. Air Force's Central Command, Pacific Air Forces, and served as Deputy Commander, U.S. Central Command. Prior to serving as the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Brown was the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. General Brown, thank you for being with us again. Last July, General Brown offered closing remarks for the 3-day Truman Civil Rights Symposium presented by the Truman Library Institute here in Washington, D.C. The panels, conversations, and presentations, including President Biden's keynote on this stage, explored my grandfather's watershed executive order that desegregated the U.S. Armed Forces and helped pave the way for civil rights victories and racial justice in the 1950s and 60s. I encourage you to check it out on the Institute's YouTube channel, where everything goes to live eventually, where you'll also find tonight's program archived. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage General C.Q. Brown, Jr.
On the 4th of April, 1949, President Harry Truman signed the Washington Treaty, and he said, "This is a simple document. But if it existed in 1914 and in 1939, supported by the nations who are represented here today, I believe it would have prevented the acts of aggression which led to 2 world wars. Out of the suffering and destruction of 2 world wars, NATO was born. Born out of hope for a better future and a commitment to preserve peace and stability. President Truman and his fellow leaders knew that the best protection against an uncertain future was to strengthen the partnership of nations who shared a desire for freedom and for peace. Not just to build a short-term treaty to deal with an immediate threat, or make a commitment that was a pragmatic product of circumstance, but to build an everlasting framework and to bring 12 nations together that shared a belief in democracy, individual liberties, and rule of law. 75 years ago, a simple document was signed, and NATO was born, and is now 32 nations strong. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. It's a distinct honor to not only serve as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but to be the keynote speaker at this evening's event. I want to thank the National Archives for hosting the tributes to such a significant milestone. It's particularly fitting that we're here, where the 1949 Washington Treaty that established NATO is stored. It's currently on display this month in the honor of the NATO Summit. I want to thank also to the Truman Library Institute and to Clifton for all you do in preserving the principles of your grandfather, President Truman, all that he valued. As Clifton highlighted last year, I had the opportunity to speak at the Truman Civil Rights Symposium, celebrating another 75th anniversary of Executive Order 9981, which formally integrated the U.S. military. Another major landmark achieved under President Truman's leadership, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak again at the Truman Library Institute, marking another historic anniversary. I'm also very honored to share the stage with Admiral Rob Bauer, who I've come to know fairly closely in the 9 months I've been the chairman, but also to all the other panelists that will follow this evening. You know, for the past 75 years, NATO has deterred aggression and promoted prosperity and provided a source of stability for the world. Today, the purpose and principles of NATO alliance are being tested in an increasingly complex global security environment. U.S. national defense strategy lays out 5 key challenges: People's Republic of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and violent extremists. All 5 of these challenges are active at the same time and are becoming interconnected. The People's Republic of China continues to undertake aggressive military behavior in the South China Sea, while also attempting to increase its global influence through economic and political statecraft. Russia's unprovoked invasion of its sovereign neighbor, Ukraine, entered its 3rd year in February, while continuing to focus on building novel capabilities and diversifying their nuclear arsenal. Iran attempts to further conflict and regional influence through their proxies. North Korea persists in destabilizing the region with ongoing ballistic missile research and testing. And violent extremists continue to use instability to advance their beliefs. This is not the first time that America and its allies have faced challenging times. And Truman and the leaders of the 11 other founding nations of NATO knew in 1949 that we are stronger together. NATO represents more than just 32 like-minded nations, more than just the unified military force of 32 countries. It demonstrates the strength possible when nations with shared values come together, focus on achieving a shared vision. Collectively, NATO's most significant strategic asset is the relationships and collaboration we have with our allies and partners. And to maximize that advantage, we must be truly integrated. We can't develop our respective national plans and capabilities with allies and partners as an afterthought. We need to start at the beginning with the end in mind. We, as an alliance, need to be integrated by design. This requires repeated engagements, training evolutions, and increasingly complex exercises. It requires that relationships we have with each other be rooted in long-standing cooperation, personal connections, and shared experiences. True integration means we can adapt to dynamic situations. True integration allows us to shape crises rather than respond to crises. Integration just doesn't happen. It takes work. Relationships take work. Consensus takes work. And as the results of our work are far greater than the sum of our parts, we are stronger together. You know, I saw this personally when I was the Air Component Commander for the United States Central Command during the campaign to defeat ISIS. And what began in 2014 as an effort to push back ISIS resulted in an 87-member coalition to defeat ISIS. This coalition coordinated across diplomatic, financial, and information spaces. It was integrated by design, and its effects were clear. By 2017, ISIS was pushed out of Iraq, and by 2019, was territorially defeated in Syria. Though it was not a NATO operation, it was a product of strong relationships fostered by NATO. An example of what is possible through the strength of collaboration. Today, I see the power of countries working together in Ukraine's fight to defend itself from Russian aggression. That Russian aggression designed to splinter NATO has had an opposite effect, bringing life into the alliance with a renewed purpose and increasing its size. For more than 2 years, a group of 50 nations, including all 32 members of NATO, have been meeting monthly to organize support for Ukraine. The Ukraine Defense Contact Group has coordinated more than $95 billion in direct security assistance and trained over 143,000 Ukrainians. These efforts have been a critical reason why Ukraine has been successful in repelling a larger and supposed more capable force, because we are stronger together. As we look ahead at the future of NATO, I want to share with you 3 expectations I laid out to our joint force on my second day as the chairman. 3 expectations I believe have applicability within NATO. Honing our warfighting skill has primacy in all we do. Modernize and aggressively lead with new concepts and approaches, and trust is the foundation of our profession. Honing our warfighting skill has primacy in all we do. We exist to fight and win our nation's wars. We want to be so good at what we do that our adversaries never want to engage us in conflict. We want to be their worst nightmare in a fight. These past 75 years, NATO has been effective because together we've had built credible deterrence. It starts at the national level with what each nation brings to the alliance, the skill sets of our service members and the expertise of our militaries. Then it's how we work seamlessly across domains and across nations, and how we come together as a combined allied force. We also need to modernize and aggressively lead with new concepts and approaches, ensuring that we have the right tools, capabilities, and strategies to adapt to the dynamic and complex environment of the future. NATO is doing just that. With a set of operational plans that are part of the concept for deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, NATO has a blueprint to continually modernize collective defense. And as this week at the NATO Summit, as President Biden and Secretary Austin both mentioned this week, our collaboration is producing results. 10 years ago, only 3 NATO nations spent 2% of GDP on defense. This year, that number is now at 23 nations. We may sometimes have a different approach, but we all have a common goal: to ensure our warfighters have the capabilities, planning, and training to deter and to fight and win if called upon to do so. That requires us to think differently and move faster. We need to prepare like we're in a crisis before the crisis, looking ahead holistically, balancing both capability and capacity, and making sure we have put those capabilities into the hands of our warfighters as quickly as possible. No matter the nation, every military capability we have is a static display without our service members. Which leads me to the 3rd expectation. Trust is the foundation of our profession. Trust that we do right by our service members. the trust of our families that we will take care of them. It's the trust we have with our elected leaders and the publics we serve. And most importantly, it's the trust we have with each one of our NATO allies and partners. Trust is the foundation of any treaty, earned through hardships, battle, sacrifice, but rooted in shared values and approaches. And trust is what has given NATO its strength over the past 75 years, because we are stronger together. As we continue to look forward to the future, we see nations who wish to overthrow the international order and whose actions recklessly threaten global stability. In the early 20th century, violent aggressors led to some of the most horrific events in history. We have something today that the world didn't have then, that leaders of 12 nations had the foresight to give us in a simple document 75 years ago. What has become the strongest and longest alliance the world has ever seen, an alliance for freedom and for peace. May NATO continue to be a beacon of freedom and peace for the next 75 years to come. And whether we look back 75 years or look ahead 75 years, one thing I know remains true: we are stronger together. Thank you.
Panel discussion. Please hold for the panel discussion. Please hold for the panel discussion. Please welcome the Chief Executive Officer of Center for a New American Security, Richard Fontaine.
Good evening. Those were fantastic remarks from their two military officers. A real privilege to hear that. We are going to follow that with a look not only forward, but also a look backward. It's 75th anniversary of NATO's founding, as we all know, and we will have a panel discussion that'll look at the history of the alliance, its achievements, its periods of challenge, and its successes. Reflecting on where the Allies started and the path they've charted over more than 7 decades helps put today's challenges in perspective. NATO's been tested before, both by external threats and by internal disagreements, and it has, from time to time, elicited doubts on both sides of the Atlantic. And yet, through all of that and through more, it has triumphed, keeping the peace in a region previously troubled by instability. That overall success, forging an alliance rooted in shared interests and values, an enduring pact that has extended the benefit of peace to more countries over the years, that overall success was hardly inevitable. It's taken hard work, intensive diplomacy, vision, political courage, and military sacrifice. As the Allies today face a resurgent Russia, an autocracy waging war, a war of conquest in Europe, I hope our panelists can reflect on how NATO's leaders navigated the past so as to light the way forward. We will hear from Adam Howard, Chief Historian at the U.S. Department of State, Mary Elise Sarotte, a historian and author of the book Not 1 Inch, and Stephen Wertheim, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. They'll join us in just a moment, together with Stephen Erlanger, the chief diplomatic correspondent for Europe at the New York Times, who will moderate the conversation. So I would invite our panelists and moderator to the stage now and turn it over to them.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. I'm Steve Erlanger from the New York Times, and I realize President Biden's speaking. So during the NATO Summit, which I was covering, you had a lot of European diplomats sneakily looking at their phones to see what was going on with the football. So I will understand, but we won't change what happens there. What we have is a great panel, I think, to talk about NATO's achievements, its successes, also its challenges. And I think after 75 years, we can still say it is true that the US is still in, Germans are still down, and the Russians are still out. That's the famous cliche. It still holds to be true, even in this new world. But I think the best way to start would be to talk a bit about what prompted NATO. I mean, we keep talking about it as this great gift the United States gave to the world, and to some degree that's true. But I'm not sure countries are altruists. That's not how it works. So I thought I would start with Adam, the State Department historian. So talk to us about what led us to this point, and to be honest, what was in it for us?
So first of all, let me say, as a historian for the State Department, I am not the spokesperson for the State Department. So everything you hear from me tonight are my views, not necessarily those of the US government. But with that out of the way, let me just speak a little bit to the point Stephen made with the history, because I think there's a couple things that really strike me with NATO that a lot of people, I feel, assume this inevitability of NATO, but there's such an amazing history that both Admiral Bauer and General Brown brought up that really are important to understand, because if you look at the history of the United States and collective security alliances, there's really one before you get to World War II and then NATO, and that's with the French in 1778. President Washington in 1796 gives his farewell address warning against entangling alliances, and for most US policymakers, that is the standard for 150 years. Obviously, it took the cataclysm of World War II and then what was going on in Europe with the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, and that obviously set the stage for NATO. But I do think it's important to realize the fact that even when you look at, say, World War I, the United States refused to be a formal ally with Britain and France. They were an adjacent power. And then, of course, at the end of World War I, President Wilson really saw the need for a collective security alliance, and he fought diligently for the League of Nations, which itself had a collective security article, Article 10, which would have provided for the same kind of collective security that Article 5 of the NATO treaty provides. And it didn't happen. Now, there's a lot of controversy to that. President Wilson perhaps could have afforded more compromise with senators who had reservations about giving up the sovereignty that the United States had when it came to its foreign policy, because obviously collective security means attack on any partner. It means the United States is drawn to wars that many in the Congress didn't feel were necessary for the United States to be involved in. So that's one context I think is really important, that for most Americans up to World War II and even up to 1949, this notion that there would be a collective security alliance like this was just inconceivable. But so many of the events that I'm sure many of you are aware of, I mean, as soon as World War II ends, you've got a brief face-off with Iran between the US and the Soviets and the British in '46, and then Greece and Turkey, where it's internal aggression from communists, where ultimately the United States through President Truman, and the Truman Doctrine provides military aid as well as financial aid to help those governments with their internal communist issues. And of course, there is also the Marshall Plan after World War II. Obviously, that's a devastation, on a cataclysm on one level, but then of course there's very harsh winters right after World War II that puts Europe in a very difficult position. So for the United States, going to your question,
Yes, please.
the huge advantage here is by creating this collective security, one, you have the opportunity to prevent what they perceive as Soviet aggression, potentially taking Europe. Two, there's the economic element, and I think a lot of people lose sight of that with NATO. Article 2 of NATO provides for economic cooperation, and that's something that a lot of European countries wanted so that they would avoid this potential for a new authoritarian regime. And that goes back to the quote Stephen made from the first NATO Secretary General, who said, NATO is keeping the Soviets out, the United States in, and the Germans down. No more authoritarian regimes in Europe. How do you prevent that from happening? You integrate militarily, but you also integrate economically as well as socially and hopefully culturally as well. And so Article 2 of NATO. So NATO is much more than just this military alliance. It seeks to do more than that. So that's in it for the United States, but that's also in it for Western Europe.
Great. That's a great start. And then Mary Sarotte, let's leap ahead to this other really important moment in NATO's history. I mean, there are lots that we're skipping, but when the Soviet Union begins to collapse, when the wall falls down, when suddenly there's a choice to be made. I remember Madeleine Albright covering her. I mean, her original position was that NATO should disappear along with the Warsaw Pact, and that the OSCE should be in charge of European security. She changed her mind later, but this was out there. And so you've written a lot about Germany. Your latest book, which we even have with you, is called Not 1 Inch. Hold it up. It's a really good diplomatic history of how NATO expanded, particularly to a Germany that in some ways was an unfinished country. I mean, it was a divided country. And this is why we sometimes think of Ukraine. I mean, what can happen to Ukraine? I mean, can Ukraine come into the alliance? I mean, not so much at war, but without regaining all of its territory. So talk a bit about this moment that actually changed NATO tremendously, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, it is a real honor to be here and to speak after the Admiral, after the General who spoke, to be here with you. And it is an honor to be part of this event on its 75th anniversary, an event that celebrates nations working together in this time of division and conflict. I feel honored to have even some small part in it. I was studying abroad in West Berlin in 1989 when a few things happened. One of which was that I decided to become a historian to understand what was happening. And I did not sadly expect that in my lifetime it would come full circle and we would be back to NATO, sadly contemplating a war with Russia again. And so I am a historian, but as Stephen was alluding to, I've recently published an article in Foreign Affairs where I've argued for using two historical examples, West Germany in the Cold War and Norway in the Cold War, as examples for how Ukraine could potentially get into NATO now. I freely admit this is a terrible idea and not a very good fit, but the problem is I'm out of good ideas, and I think a lot of other people are out of good ideas. So I think that the history is relevant. So West Germany, of course, the Berlin Wall that I got to see fall, the Berlin Wall, of course, divided the country. And Norway was the only founding member of NATO to have a border with Russia then in the Soviet Union. So you've got two countries here that are becoming NATO members despite being divided and sharing a border with Russia. And so I've recently published an article saying, hey, maybe we could learn from these examples as a way to get Ukraine into NATO as well.
That's good. No, because, I mean, Steve, we've talked a lot about what to do with Ukraine, but what's your take on what, I mean, I used to joke, if NATO is the answer, what's the question? right? So, I mean, that's what I'm going to pose to you. I mean, was it the right answer to the right question?
Well, delighted to be here as well. I think NATO was the right answer to the problem of potential Soviet aggression after World War II. That was the main original purpose, I would say. And then your question becomes a very appropriate one in the post-Cold War world, where, as you mentioned, it made intuitive sense to a lot of people that if the Warsaw Pact was going to go away, if indeed the Soviet Union was going to go away, so should NATO. And I think what's happened in the post-Cold War period is that NATO has searched for a purpose in the absence of that original Soviet threat. Richard Lugar, the Republican senator, said in 1993 that NATO would have to go out of area or out of business. And so it did. One of the new missions that NATO took on over the last 3 decades has been out-of-area operations in the Balkans, in the 1990s in Afghanistan, as well as in Libya. And the other thing that became really central to NATO's purpose was enlargement itself, which was driven by a number of reasons, not least the demand of countries in Central and Eastern Europe to join the alliance. But for members of the alliance, there were, 2 different kinds of considerations at play. One was the desire to shore up liberal market democracy in the countries that joined, so they set conditions, political conditions on entrance. But the other one was the potential for Russia to become more aggressive in the future.
Can I give an answer to that question, too?
Sure.
So,
So can you.
if NATO is the answer, what's the question, and why NATO? There's been a continual debate in this country going back hundreds of years, well, a couple hundred years.
Too many.
Not too many.
Hundreds of years.
Hundreds. Let's say 100 plus. And the question is, because the United States is between these 2 giant oceans, do we in the United States start our territorial defense on the near side or on the far side of our oceans, right? And the answer used to be, why, of course, we start our territorial defense on the near side of our oceans. What else would we do? But then, of course, we had World War I, but then we reverted to isolationism, and we said, no, we're going to start our defense on the near side of our oceans, and then we got World War II. So finally, after World War II, we realized maybe starting our territorial defense together with others, as the general said, stronger together, on the far side of the oceans makes more sense. And so that's why NATO, right? So if NATO is the answer, what's the question? The question is, well, do we start our defense on the near side or the far side of our oceans? And if the answer is the far side, then NATO is the way we do that.
But that brings me, because one of the big debates with enlargement was it going to make the world safer, in fact, or was it going to create a sort of revanchist Russia? I mean, I lived in Russia and covered the first NATO enlargement here, and I always felt that there was a very strong feeling in Russia that, almost like Germany in 1918, that we'd taken advantage of its weakness, its collapse, and in a way it was an unfair settlement. This is Putin's theory. And particularly when, Poland, fine, the first tranche, but then when we promised in 2008, and I was at the Bucharest summit, when NATO said it would take in Ukraine and Georgia, would become members, but without stating how or when. And in a way, Putin's been trying to shut that door ever since. I mean, it took him 4 months in 2008 when he started something on Georgia, but Ukraine sits there. So I mean, I guess what I'm trying to ask you is, in this debate, is this still a live debate, or is this still a sense of just Russian hurt and it wasn't really fair and people have the right to choose their own alliances. Was it a mistake to push NATO to enlarge that far without a Warsaw Pact behind it when Russia was clearly falling apart? That's kind of the question. Anyone who wants to, Steve, do you want to?
Sure, yeah, I mean, I think that
start talking about
the question of whether the United States should have a defense perimeter that starts at the near, or ends at the near shores, or the Western Hemisphere, or extends to Eurasia, that was settled after World War II. And that's not really enough to explain the enlargement of NATO after the Cold War, because NATO could have kept in place with a reunified Germany, not enlarged, and the United States would still have had an expansive definition of its interest. It could have potentially kept those security commitments. So what explains the push for enlargement? I think that the United States adopted a different calculus, which was a desire for primacy. And so, you know, one of the key choices, I think, coming out of the early 1990s was, should the United States and NATO allies aim for a security system in Europe that would be one that respected what the Soviets turned Russians said was their core interests, whether we like it or not, and have a more of a pan-European security architecture. And that was put on the table at the time by a variety of actors, including the Soviets. And, you know, the answer was a pretty clear no. And that, I think, is quite evident, you know, from the very beginning of the 1990s in the first Bush administration and so forth. So I think one of the challenges with the enlargement process was that it started small, but it was an open door process in which the alliance continued to tell more countries, we understand you don't want to be left in between an expanding NATO and Russia, whose intentions remain at best unknown. So we will be trying to incorporate more countries more and more. And the problem is that is going to leave some countries out. And so I think one of the difficulties with enlargement was it did not create a secure environment for countries, at least some countries, that were inevitably going to be left in between.
And of course, Ukraine is a perfect example because Ukraine, in a way, was the buffer country between Poland and Russia. If it's part of NATO, then NATO's border with Russia gets even longer. And, you know, it's hard to say no to people who want to join, but I think it's also true, at least it's my, you know, having spent time in Ukraine and Russia in Europe, it's not like we weren't seducing them either. I mean, there was always the Brzezinski line that said, Russia with Ukraine is an empire, and Russia without Ukraine could be a normal state. And to me, that line is always kind of, in a way, has underlined our policy. It's not been our explicit policy. Does this fit with what you see?
Well, I'm sorry.
In the histories, or
I mean,
or am I putting you in a complicated position?
Well, I'll speak to one element that came up about Putin and his perception, because that's not unique to Putin. I mean, as much as there's been a lot made of Putin's use and misuse of history, this is something that, you know, Stalin and others would always reference the fact that here the Soviet Union had been invaded twice, World War I, World War II, they can go further back to Napoleon. And so there was this perception of how this was, you know, a real threat to them. And so it's going to be very interesting. I know my office publishes the official documentary history of U.S. foreign relations, so we're working on the documents of this period to get them declassified and published, and it's going to be interesting to see, were these policymakers in NATO sensitive to this, or did they feel, no, this is just, you know, a misuse of history in order to justify preventing NATO from expanding? So I think that's important to understand this is not something just unique to that period, but further back in the mindset.
Yeah, if I could just jump It is important to say clearly that the countries of Central and Eastern Europe wanted to join NATO, right? So this is, to a certain extent, a demand-driven process, right? So this is not just something that was happening. It's not one hand clapping. Obviously, this is still, you said, is still a current debate. Obviously, this is still a current debate. I think that, and I've written this in the book, I am a fan of NATO enlargement. I'm glad that it happened. Central and Eastern European countries wanted to be in NATO. The Baltics, I see representatives of Estonia here, wanted to be in NATO. They had every right to choose their security alliance, and they had every right to join the alliance. And I support that. I'm glad NATO enlarged. My criticism is with how that happened, because it left Ukraine in the lurch. And people knew that at the time that was happening. And that was one of the biggest surprises in my research, was just how early on people realized, President Clinton and his team, I'm paraphrasing, but the exact quotes are in the book, that Ukraine was the linchpin of peace in Europe. And so there were intermediate plans that I think were more promising to provide a kind of, that would have provided a berth for Ukraine and other post-Soviet states in a face-saving way, both for them and for Russia. And I say this not as an act of altruism. I say this because this is often forgotten. This time period was also the moment of the greatest nuclear disarmament since the invention of the atomic bomb. Washington and Moscow were working hand in hand to not only take out of service or dismantle, but to destroy weapons, to blow up silos, to turn them into sunflower fields. And that made not only the United States and Russia safer, that made the whole world safer. And the then Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, was aware of this. And he went to President Clinton as it became clear that Clinton was, instead of keeping a sort of halfway option for Ukraine or other places, Clinton was moving towards an all or nothing model, which is what we have now, which is one of the reasons why we have the challenge now that we have nothing to offer Ukraine other than full NATO membership or nothing. Bill Perry wanted some kind of halfway model so we could provide a berth for Ukraine. And he went to Clinton and he said, President Clinton, I understand that countries in Central and Eastern Europe wanted to be in NATO yesterday, but I, Bill Perry, I'm Secretary of Defense of the United States, and I'm supposed to keep the United States safe. And I'm currently doing an amazing job. I am literally flying to Kyiv and helping detonate silos that were targeting American citizens. So let us move carefully on NATO enlargement so we can keep destroying these weapons that can end civilization within an hour. And so that, I think, is really the challenge, is that people who made that argument lost out. And NATO enlargement wasn't one thing. There were multiple visions for NATO enlargement known at the time. And unfortunately, the one that was, I think, most injurious to relations with Russia, and again, I say this not out of altruism, but because they're a strategic nuclear power, was the model that won out. And it left Ukraine in the lurch, because once you go to all or nothing, then Ukraine is going to get nothing.
And then, of course, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons, which it,
yes, and then
which
that
it
yes.
inherited.
Yes, it agreed to give up for assurances.
For assurances,
and then,
not guarantees.
Not guarantees. And
That's
then, of course, what happened when, right? So the problem is, so for me, that was probably the most amazing part of the research, was just to discover just how clearly people saw that dynamic. In the early 90s, Tony Lake, the National Security Advisor, his solution was put Ukraine in NATO. There's one document I found where Tony Lake suggested it to Clinton, and Clinton put his left-handed check mark on it and wrote, looks good. NATO membership for Ukraine, 1994. It was clear that Ukraine was going to be a problem, and that's why Bill Perry in the Pentagon was arguing for what was called the Partnership for Peace. Now, the Partnership for Peace still exists. It's celebrating its 30th anniversary, but it's a shadow of its former self. It was initially conceived as the route to NATO membership, and it was useful because it decoupled NATO membership from geography. So you didn't just move this line eastward, right? You could join it and then become interoperable, and then gradually some countries would become members and some wouldn't. Ukraine could and did join that, so it provided a berth for Ukraine. But then it gets pushed aside by this vision of no, where it's going to be all or nothing, and then you start to get, into confrontation.
Yeah, I mean, one could keep going on Ukraine because it is fascinating. I mean, because, what worries me, and I've been in the Maidan, and I have a lot of friends there. I just worry we're lying to the Ukrainians. That's my personal worry.
Yes.
We're lying to them about NATO membership and actually about EU accession too. This is like years and years and years down the road.
Well, to be fair, it's always years and years for EU accession.
It's always years and years and years. But I mean, this was one of the debates for NATO enlargement too. I mean, should EU membership come before NATO enlargement? And I think it was right that it went the other way around. But one of the things I would like to talk a bit about, and we can come back to Ukraine, is there's this conventional wisdom now that Donald Trump or not, American interests are going to shift toward China, which they're doing already. We have 100,000 American troops in Europe, boosted considerably since the invasion of Ukraine. I don't assume that number will stay that big. I mean, why should it? And so the assumption is, and Admiral Bauer's talked quite a lot about this, which is Europe needs to do more, no matter what happens in America, for its own defense, for its own interests. And this is kind of one of these undercurrents of this summit, but nobody's really talking much about it. There's a lot of rhetoric about how, yeah, we've got to do more. The question is what needs to be done and how much will it cost for Europe really to create a pillar that deters Russia with less American help, so that the current cliche is to repel, not expel, right? To sort of keep the Russians out without having to push them out if they actually test NATO. So I'm curious what you consider the biggest challenges to that, besides money, which is real. Europe's rich, but are people convinced, as Admiral Bauer's tried to convince them, that Ukraine is a direct national security issue for the rest of Europe, and that Russia will present a problem for years to come? I mean, there are foreign ministers in Europe who have said, not just the Estonians, but the Norwegians, the Swedes, that Russia could reconstitute itself in the next 3 to 7 years, and would Europe use this window to create a better deterrent for itself? If anyone wants to talk to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Europe does have a lot of work to do. Look, the whole NATO alliance has a lot of work to do, because we talked about the different kinds of purposes that it set out for itself in the post-Cold War world, as of course the core mission of territorial defense and deterrence remained, but it really has gone to the back burner. And the kinds of capabilities acquired to do out-of-area operations are different from those that are needed to focus on that core mission. So it's really back to basics. But, you know, I think this is an ongoing, very live debate about what kind of role can we expect the United States to play in the alliance. But I do think that keep the Americans in rationale for NATO is going away. I do think this time is different, even though we've been here before and had discussions about America staying power, you know, through much of the Cold War. And it has to do with a number of factors that go beyond the immediate political candidates that we see today. It has to do with the specific nature of the threat posed by Russia, which is an acute and very real threat to countries close to Russia, but not so much a conventional military threat to overrun Europe in the way that the Red Army was capable of doing if the Soviet Union tried to do that without being stopped. So that makes it very difficult, I think, for the United States to manage that problem, because it's facing extreme costs, potentially, in taking the lead in defending all NATO territory for a threat to underlying U.S. interests, because Russia is far from poised, and this is a very good thing, from being a European hegemon, right? That strategic calculus is difficult for American management. It's less difficult, potentially, for Europe to deal with it, because Russia does threaten the European project, which has come a long way now. And I'm actually, you know, despite the difficulties in unifying Europe around a common threat perception of Russia, I am actually encouraged on balance by what we've seen in the last several years. And I think, you know, Europe, because it has such extreme material advantages, demographic, economic, over Russia. There could be some inefficiencies and some countries that are not willing to do what's needed, such that if the United States moves to more of a supporting rather than a leading role within the NATO alliance when it comes to defending Europe, I'm relatively optimistic that Europe would be able to step up at this point. But absolutely, an enormous amount of work to do, and I think the underlying drivers of the strategic shift for the United States are going to remain regardless of who's in the Oval Office next.
So I'm coming back to your question. Are we lying to the Ukrainians? So as ever, you say the question that people are thinking about, but don't quite trust themselves to say. So that's always helpful to have someone who will say that. I would like to explicitly praise the bravery of the Ukrainians. I am continually amazed at that society, and I am, even in the face of such unspeakable horrors as the bombing of a hospital where children are being treated for cancer. It's hard to even say those words. So I would like to express my profound admiration for the Ukrainians. And also, just to recall, I know you know this, but for a non-specialist audience, that in 2008, the Bucharest Summit left Ukraine in a very difficult position. The 2008 Bucharest Summit issued a NATO declaration saying that Georgia and Ukraine will become members, period. So this debate about, should Ukraine be in NATO, technically that has been decided, right? As of 2008, the alliance said Georgia and Ukraine will become members. So we are no longer talking about whether they're going to be members, but how. Now, obviously, the how has been taking a very, very long time, right? And that's where we get into the question of, are we lying to the Ukrainians? Unfortunately, that was really the worst of all worlds, because it meant to say to Ukraine, okay, you're going to be in NATO. And in essence, we drew a target on Ukraine, because that's, a red flag to a bull with Vladimir Putin. And then we didn't let them in, right? So in a sense, it would have been better to say, look, you're not getting into Ukraine. So that, I think, was really the mistaken decision, and it's put us in this awful situation where we are now. And then, of course, I, as a historian, go back to, what you really want are options to manage contingency, And once we, in the United States, together with NATO allies, decided on this all-or-nothing NATO enlargement method as one out of many possible methods of enlarging NATO, then that was all we had, is you give Article 5 or nothing, and you just kind of keep leaving Ukraine out there dangling. So I don't know that we're lying to the Ukrainians, but somehow, even though there was thinking, at the time, people realized at the time what a danger it was to leave Ukraine in the lurch, we did it anyway, and now we're struggling with the consequences. Yeah. That would be how I would put it.
When you look at, it's probably not declassified stuff yet, but the debate over 2008 was quite interesting, because George Bush wanted to bring Ukraine in. His intelligence people didn't. They thought it was a dangerous thing to do. They've told me this. And obviously Merkel and Chirac also thought it was a bad idea. So we ended up with this weird compromise that I think David Miliband put together, who was the British foreign minister, to say, yes, but not now. Have you dug into that stuff?
So we haven't gotten that stuff for, again, back to the series we published, the Foreign Relations United States series.
I'm putting you in a difficult place, I'm sorry.
It's okay, because I can answer this very simply. Okay. Congress we don't have access to the documents until 20 years from the time of the events. And we don't publish usually about 30 years from the time of the events. But I did want to circle back quickly to something you brought up about this question of NATO. And I keep bringing us back to the origin story, but we've talked so much about security, and obviously NATO is critical in that framework, but I want to also keep going back to the European project, which I think either Mary or maybe you brought up, in that this is not just about, hey, we want to join to protect from future Soviet aggression. This is also about being part of this European family. And even when you look at NATO, the treaty signed in spring of '49, if you go back a year to the Brussels Treaty that was signed by Western European countries, the Benelux countries, Britain, France, this was something where they were showing a very proactive energy that they wanted to not just create the security on a military level, but the idea that, again, it was important to them to try to get Europe to integrate, to, yes, make sure Germany never comes up, but also to make sure that Europe integrates in such a way that economically, culturally, et cetera, and science is part of this too. That's something people don't realize about NATO. There's a whole scientific project within NATO. That's part of a desire that goes on when those first tranches start coming in. I mean, I'm not trying to downplay fear of Russia, but I think that's something we might lose a little sight of how important that was in 48, 49, and how important it's been all through.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because, I mean, to me, it is the great success of NATO, which was to keep the French and Germans from killing each other again, right? I mean, which is they've done many times in the past and probably would do again if they had the chance, though maybe not. I once asked a senior French diplomat about the force de frappe, about the French nuclear, which is very much French. It's aimed everywhere. And I said, is it about Russia? He said, you know, actually, we think of World War I a lot in France. It's pretty much aimed at Germany. It's meant to deter Germany. It still is. Now, maybe that's a minority view, but NATO's been an enormous success at taking the poison out of these relationships and providing an umbrella for real politics to take place. And it's very hard for me to imagine the EU as it is now without NATO. I mean, that's a controversial view.
The EU may be what it is now precisely because the US moved very proactively in the 1990s to make sure that it would be the dominant security actor in Europe, and the vehicle would be through NATO, and NATO would be maintained, and in fact, NATO would be enlarged. And if you recall Madeleine Albright with her 3 Ds, right. The United States actively discouraged efforts by European countries who were interested to work together at the European level on defense. So I think, you know, there's a lot of debate when it comes to NATO enlargement about what was the effect on Russia. And that's an important debate. But one of the underrated dynamics with NATO enlargement was that it suppressed some impulses that Europeans might have had to bolster their own defenses. And as a result, look at where we are now. We have the United States in the position to be the frontline provider when anything goes wrong in Europe, as the United States can't figure out what are its interests here and does it want to be here. And perhaps we didn't have to be in this situation, and I think this is really the main challenge for the alliance going forward. And I have to say, I'll compliment the French and the Germans. I believe that I am not particularly worried about them coming to blows, and I think we actually have to figure out what are we worried about. So if we're going to say that we're worried about you know, the Germany being too aggressive in the future, but also Germany being too passive, those are contradictory worries. We actually have to prioritize. I am worried about, if the United States pulls back from the alliance, I'm worried about Germany doing too little,
yes.
Not too much.
Yeah. Which was always the Radek-Sikorski line, right. Which is, I want Germans to be less shy and do more leading.
Yes.
I mean, NATO, you talked about, you know, what is NATO for? At its core, NATO is to prevent great power conflict. And France and Germany are no longer great powers of it, you know, on the level of, you know, the United States, Russia, China in different ways. It's not a strategic nuclear power, despite all the recent building, but obviously it's a major economic power. And NATO, in essence, has now come back to that core mission. So I'm with Stephen on this. I'm not staying awake nights worrying about the French and the Germans.
No. I mean, I don't overemphasize what I said, but I mean, the irony is, of course, that now we want Europe to do more. We encourage, and the Europeans say, do you really mean it this time? And it's a legitimate question, yes. Right? And part of it has to do with arms sales, right? I mean, and American arms sales. So right now, if I get this right, European countries of their military procurements, at least 63% come from outside the EU. And a lot of that is American. And frankly, if you're a European taxpayer, maybe that's not the best kind of deal, right? Because you want your taxes also to create jobs at home. So there's all kinds of issues about whether there's less America and what it means to have more Europe. And I agree the trend is a good one. I just worry about the pace. And I do worry about the ability of countries as rich as they are to spend the money required. I mean, the German request for a higher defense budget for 2025 has just been whacked back because of the Schwarzenegger balanced budget problem. The French Parliament, I don't know what happens with the French Parliament, but they run the budget.
I hear the EU can issue bonds now.
Well, we'll see.
Interesting.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. So, I mean, generally, I'm encouraged. In the few minutes we have left, I mean, there's lots of things to talk about, but I would like to come back to Ukraine and just ask the question, is there a way to bring Ukraine into the Western world, into a secure place, so it keeps its sovereignty, it can rebuild itself without necessarily being a NATO member right away, and without necessarily getting back all of its territory since 1991, even if it considers that, as Germany did, something to debate for the future. So, I mean, I'm curious whether anyone wants to talk to that possibility. It's something the Ukrainians don't want to talk about, that's for sure.
Well,
and the White House doesn't want to talk about it, but this is life.
You know, we need to think seriously about war termination and what kind of terms are acceptable to Ukraine and its partners. And if we don't think that a full Ukrainian liberation of all territory is in the cards, and if we're wondering about whether time is on Ukraine's side or not, then talking while fighting, not as an alternative to fighting, but talking becomes an important step. And I think it's unfortunate that negotiations have become stigmatized. So now it's politically costly for political leaders in NATO countries, as well as Ukraine, to openly talk about this, as you allude to. So we need a kind of not an end game that we think we can just get to, because we're not the only party here, but a theory of the end game that is realistic. And I agree that NATO membership for Ukraine is not very, very unlikely to be part of that end game to the conflict, and it's very hard to see what would happen after that.
I think we need a peace without Putin. And what I mean by that is, a man who has committed the crimes in Bucha that he did, a man who is bombing a hospital where children are receiving cancer care, this is not a credible negotiation partner. There is nothing he could sign at this point that we would believe. So I do not actually believe in negotiations. My argument, as bitter as it is for the Ukrainians who deserve better, is that the Ukrainians should, following a West German example, tolerate a provisional border. They should declare an end to major combat, declare a provisional border, but in the sense that it's not recognized, that it's going to be changed. Again, I don't say this with any happiness. It's a stomach-turning suggestion. But it would be good to stop as much of the killing as possible. And so Kiev should declare a provisional border and say this will be our independent Ukraine, and that can become a safe haven. And the troops on the front will know that their families are safe here. And then in exchange, that part of independent Ukraine would then be in NATO, as West Germany was in NATO, with the understanding that it would not use force to try, unless it's under threat of attack, and that then it would follow the Norwegian example of limiting the amount of infrastructure on its territory, which is what made Norwegian membership tolerable to Moscow. Now, the Ukrainians deserve better.
Explain what that means, though, for people.
Well, it means
limiting infrastructure, what does that mean?
Oh, so it means saying things like the Norwegians, when they joined NATO, because they were Soviet adjacent but not Soviet controlled, unlike the Baltics, which didn't have a choice, which were Soviet adjacent and Soviet controlled, and bravely have emerged from that state through their own heroism. Norway decided we are going to self-impose limits. The Norwegians declared immediately prior to signing the NATO treaty that they would have no foreign troops on their territory and no nuclear weapons on their territory, with the important caveat that as long as Norway was not under attack or under threat of attack. And that made it tolerable to Moscow. So a combination of Ukraine imposing Norwegian-style limitations and then also recognizing provisional border would at least allow an independent Ukraine to become part of
Good. No, because, I mean, part of it is one has to fight at least until Vladimir Putin decides he's not going to gain anything else. And then perhaps one can have some sort of conversation.
Well, actually, I mean, what I think is what Putin seems to have respected is Article 5. That's the heart of the NATO treaty.
Yes,
The article that declares an attack on one is an attack on all. And for everything that he's done, all of the war crimes, even when he apparently considered using nuclear weapons in 2022, when things were going badly, he has, and I admit there have been, nibbles on borders, like in Poland and so forth, but he has not, in a serious way, challenged an Article 5 country. In fact, the Finns, now that they're in NATO, they've never seen that border so undefended.
Yeah, but I'm concerned that when we talk about this correlation between Article 5 and Russia not attacking a country, we need to think about what makes deterrence work in a holistic way. It's not the piece of paper, Article 5. It's also the credibility that the members of NATO will actually fight for that country.
Yes.
And if we don't even have NATO, foreign NATO forces in Ukraine, but we say, after having not intervened to actually defend Ukraine since 2014, now what's left of Ukraine is protected by Article 5. If I'm sitting in Moscow, I don't think that that's credible, and I now have an opportunity to destroy NATO by shattering Article 5 and showing that it's a dead letter, or we have World War III.
Well, no, the Norwegian provision, first of all, it has worked for Norway, number one. And number two, the provision is under attack or under threat of attack. Right.
Well, we're not going to resolve
no.
this tonight, unfortunately. We've run out of time, but I've had a great time, and I hope this has been useful for everyone. So if we could thank the panel. And then to bring Alex Burden up to the stage.
I didn't see too many people watching the press conference.
Tough act to follow. My name's Alex Burden. I'm the executive director of the Truman Library Institute, the nonprofit partner of the Harry Truman Library and Museum in Independence, Missouri. I want to thank our panelists, Stephen, Mary Elise, Adam, for your participation. Can we have another round of applause for them, please? I also want to thank Admiral Bauer and General Brown for accepting our invitation to speak tonight, for being here, for joining us, for your powerful comments. I really appreciate that very much. I want to thank our partners at CNAS, Richard, Andrea, Kate, and Leighton. Thank you for your fantastic work on this project. It's been great working with you, and I look forward to working with you again in the future. I'm going to keep it short. Brevity is the essence of wit, right? So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for your interest in Harry Truman and history. This isn't just history, it's modern times. What happened 75 years ago is so relevant to what's happening today. If you just think about what Harry Truman did from 1946 to 1949 and how relevant that is today. The only difference, back then it was the Soviet Union and communist threats. Now we're calling it Russia. But in that period, we had the food relief program, we had the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine. You can learn all about this at the Truman Library in Independence. If you haven't been there, I encourage you to come. If you're in the Kansas City area, visit the library, visit our website, follow us on social media. We talk about these issues very frequently. So with that said, I want to thank the panel again, thank our dignitaries for being here, thank all of you. Have a great night. The first 3 rows, please remain in your seats. Everyone else, your evening is yours. Have a great night. Drive safely. Thank you.